Wherever you are.
Wherever you are.
Wherever you are.
Wherever you are.
Welcome to SGK's.
Welcome to SGK.
Welcome to SGK's around the world.
Wherever you are.
And in whatever time zone you're in.
Welcome to SGK's around the world.
Welcome to SGK's around the world.
Welcome to SGK's around the world.
Seja bem-vindo a SGK Around the World.
We hope you enjoy the session.
We hope you enjoy the session.
A gente espera que você curta a sessão.
We hope you enjoy the session.
Hello, wherever you are and in whatever time zone you're in, welcome to SGK's Around the World. Today our topic is From On-Trade to In-Home, how brands can capture post-pandemic drinking habit changes. In collaboration with Mintel, we examine how the pandemic really accelerated in-home drinking and how brands can pivot to capture this opportunity. I'm Hwang, Head of Strategy for SGK Asia Pacific.
I'm Suzanne Besson, responsible for business growth in Europe.
Hi everyone, I'm Bruce Levinson, Senior Client Director at SGK for some CPG accounts, including some beverage brands.
Hello, I'm David Luttenberger. I'm Mintel's Global Packaging Director.
Hi, I'm Martin Pasco. I'm the Spirits and Wines Analyst at Mintel, based here in London.
So let's start then. It's great to have you all here and just looking at where the pandemic took us. So really wherever we were in the world at the height of the pandemic, everyone was in home. But now the demographics of who wants to be home and who wants to be out is definitely changing. So it's interesting to look at who are those groups and what's the reasoning behind their change in decisions.
We're talking about the whole nesting phenomenon here that certainly we've seen kicking in, and by that I mean resting in place at home. And of course now consumers are navigating the easing of restrictions certainly in the US and Europe. And our data is showing in our Mintel surveys that younger drinkers are keen to get back to the on-premise. Everyone seems to miss, around 42% of respondents miss drinking in the on-premise. But younger drinkers are particularly keen. And when you look at the statement about who is comfortable to visit an indoor bar in the on-premise, 2/3 of sort of under 40s tend to be more comfortable to do that. Whereas when you go over 40, it drops off quite quickly. So I think we're going to see some more on-premise action from younger drinkers. But certainly drinking at home and nesting at home is here to stay for now.
Mm-hmm. And something to add to that, I think one of the key frames to keep in mind whenever we have this sort of topical conversation is just that markets and economies are so uneven in how they are reopening, quite honestly. So I'm here in London recording this session. Of course, London is all out in force. Australia recently out in lockdown. My colleagues in Shanghai, they're in the middle of a compound by compound lockdown. So, it is really important to keep aware. This demographic and everything that we're discussing is always quite, fast moving. And actually in some place also to loop back to Martin, what you're saying, outside of the homebody effect or the nester effect, which is, it's really hard to kickstart socializing habits. Actually, you've been cooped up for so long, quite honestly. Outside of potentially a demographic or age-related one, in places like China, we do think a bit about also how suitable the home is to socializing, quite honestly, because especially in high-density urban areas, culturally, we're also not necessarily, we don't necessarily socialize or entertain at home as much. And of course, as you get older as well, and your living conditions potentially become a little bit more conducive to entertaining at home, that might also be another reason, because if you're quite honestly in a really cramped studio apartment in the middle of Shanghai, you might be really climbing up the walls to get out as well.
Where we have created space in our homes to be suitable and exciting for getting together with our friends for that in-home drinking, we want to utilise that space ongoing, right? And we've built up communities as well. We're talking to neighbours that we may not have met before the pandemic. That's certainly happening where I live. So you're building closer relationships close to home in some cases, which makes it easier to get together still in in their home and have those drinking experiences.
I would add to that, I think, very often drinking is a catalyst for togetherness. And if you might be perhaps younger or living in a city, that togetherness could be meeting new people. If you're out in the suburbs like myself, it might be getting together with close friends. But nonetheless, you want a place and a venue that's going to cater to different needs, and which may be age related or maybe where you live. To your point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I would add to the discussion that the nesting trend is driven not only by anxieties about going back out for some people, but it's also, of course, now intersecting with the onset of inflation, and so those consumers on lower and mid incomes are going to feel their disposable income squeezed a fair bit, and discretionary items like alcohol, may be cut back on a little bit. So in-home drinking, there is a real case for continuing with in-home drinking, because consumers have learned during lockdowns to appreciate the cost savings that they've been paying for at-home drinks versus what they would have paid in the on-premise. So that's another reason why at-home drinking will still continue for the immediate future.
I think there's also sort of a corollary here that maybe we didn't see coming, that during the pandemic, we were seeing what we're calling stockpiling, where consumers were buying just out of fear that something wouldn't be available. Then things opened up, and now we've got inflation, we've got other things going on, still having supply chain interruptions. But I think now we're beginning to see that consumers may be stockpiling because of inflation, because of gas prices. They're not going to be traveling and getting out as much. They're consolidating their shopping trips, and so maybe they're going to buy more multi-packs, not only for fear that it's not going to be available, but because the price may be going up in a very short period of time, and they want to have that. So that sort of thing we saw with stockpiling of multi-packs of all types of drinks out of availability fears. Now we're seeing it perhaps in terms of multi-packs just because of pricing, potential price increases, even if hopefully they are short-lived.
Mm-hmm. So just changing direction a little bit, because what we've seen also is a rise in the theme of wellness and therefore healthier and low ABV options is another major trend to emerge. What do you think has enabled this change in behaviour, and should brands market their low ABV consumers differently than their primary audience?
Yeah, so I mean this drills down to the trend for alcohol moderation, and I would just first of all like to say that trend existed before COVID came along, particularly in Europe. We've been tracking it for the last 5 years, and we know, for example, in the UK, 45% of younger people 18 to 34 are limiting or moderating the amount of alcohol that they consume, and that is typical around Europe. The change was that last year, in 2021, our data started to show that this trend was now emerging in other regions. So in the US, in Brazil, in China, for the first time, we were seeing consumers saying, yes, I'm intending to drink less, and then actually I am drinking less. It doesn't mean they've stopped. It just means they're more conscious of how much they have. And ultimately, they'll be looking for more permissible drinks in spirits, wines, and RTDs. And so permissible drinks already existed. I mean, hard seltzers is the classic example of a permissible lower alcohol drink. But more and more brands are starting to take on the on-pack lexicon, so to speak, of permissibility, and they lead on flavors. But of course, all of the healthier cues which consumers are looking for within their choice of alcohol are getting dialed up. So that's your low sugar, low carb, low alcohol content, and clean white packaging, which dials up naturalness in the case of seltzers.
Mm.
Yeah, and I'll build on Martin's comments there about permissibility and the on-pack communication, because that is really important. not only in the drinks category, but in the terms of the healthier products, we begin to see what we call the emergence of essentialism of design, where rather than flooding packages with a lot of different messages, we're seeing just 2 or 3 essential on-pack communication points, whether it's the alcohol content, whether it's the health content, whether it's maybe the flavor profile or a healthier or functional ingredient. But brands can really tap into that idea of essentialism, as Martin said, using more white. I like to say we use splashes of color in packaging design rather than flooding with color. And those splashes of color should be a call to attention, a punctuation mark or an accent mark to a functional ingredient or a calorie content or some other healthy benefit for you. So the idea of the consumption and the package design and the branding come together to create sort of a healthier ethos around the brand is something we've really begun to see as well.
I think it's a really exciting category actually, because it's all about choice, isn't it? Because I think what we're finding is that, this moderation point, it doesn't mean people are constantly reducing or going into a kind of sober state, if you like, or completely abstaining from alcohol, but it's about maybe the occasion or just regulating that a little bit. And having the choice that's available now is really exciting for that. So Martin, you're right, we've been hearing our customers talk about this category for the last 5 years, but I think it feels like it's really exploded in the last couple of years. We're seeing so many different products and different flavours and really exciting drinks for those who are choosing that occasion to be a non or a low alcoholic one.
Just to build on that, Sandy, I feel like as consumers make choices that may be healthier or lower ABV, it isn't necessarily consuming less. It's just consuming differently. So it's an opportunity for brands to maybe stretch their brand a bit, offer more options and choice to consumers looking for something new, but want to stay within the franchise of a brand that speaks to them.
Yeah.
I do think one of the biggest sea change or biggest structural changes is really expansion of the need state, right? Because if you put health and lower ABV and the keyword of permissibility, once again, I think one of the key things that we'll be chatting about as we discuss this topic is even, well, how long does this trend last? But quite honestly, it's about a much wider repertoire of options, and now even for all-day drinking, which you can do and you probably had to do when you were locked down. But the need states have changed. So probably in a few years back, all of the need states, obviously they're all heavily social. It's just dialing up or down the emotion of how much you let go, or if it's light social. But there's just a lot more, quite honestly, just simple drinking for relaxation. And low ABV and zero ABV let you do that on a psychological level, but also physically permissible level from 9 a.m. to whenever, quite honestly. So I personally think that the size of pie is incredible now because the lines have completely blurred, accentuated also by health, low ABV, and the pandemic.
And to think about how brands must talk to consumers in this space, bearing in mind that we've talked about consumers having that flexitarian approach. We're seeing brands like Tanqueray and Gordon's and Grey Goose bring out lower or no alcohol version of the original brand. Do we think that that's because they need to have that same voice for the consumer, because the consumer in effect is the same?
Well, I think if you allow me to comment on that, it was a really exciting time because we're seeing all of these big brands piling in. So Diageo, have done Gordon 0%, they've done Tanqueray 0%. You've got Pernod Ricard piling in with Beefeater. I mean, gin is big in Europe, of course, so there are a lot of gin drinkers to convert to low and no, and Beam Suntory. So we're getting to the point where we're going to reach critical mass, and they're really, bringing their big advertising budgets and distribution networks to this. But we're also seeing lower. So the Grey Goose example you just mentioned is dear to my heart. It actually is a 30% ABV vodka rather than a 40%. So it's dropped just a little bit of ABV, but it's still saying permissible. And there are room for both of these for non-alcoholic as well as lower ABV options. And the big brand investment in these, I think, shows that these big companies expect that this will be an opportunity that will grow in the near future.
There's a bit of self-preservation as well, which is to extend the brand and offer something for consumers rather than have them make the decision to consume less because there isn't something that satisfies that need. So no, that proliferation of options is a very smart business move.
And it's also about maintaining that kind of theatre of cocktail making, I guess, for those who are not drinking on that occasion as well. So they're not missing out on that kind of sense of occasion or sense of theatre.
I do think the democratization of cocktail culture is actually a massive sea change that will drive a much longer tail impact in the next few years, simply because, as you were saying previously, it's the preserve of bartenders. Now a lot of outfits do let you do mixology sets really easily. So during the process, you have to think always in terms of how consumer expectations and base level behavior is being changed. They're being educated, they're being entertained in the beginning out of necessity because there was no other option, but this knowledge stays with them. So we do foresee that like their expectation of quality and their connoisseurship of quality, along with all of the ease and simplicity of a lot of these direct-to-consumer subscription-based mixology sets and also online content, will actually influence future consumer choices, whether it's on-trade or off-trade.
So we've talked a lot about occasions, and occasion-based shopping has also emerged as a trend from COVID, even for those low ABV occasions that we just talked about. How has that changed the consumer journey, both in-store and, of course, online?
So I think, e-commerce has obviously been growing across so many categories, and spirits and drinks are no exception. Here in North America, there are really two different models. There's the retailers themselves, like Drizzly, an online liquor store, effectively, as well as other options like wine.com, or the last mile services like Instacart, where you can get a bundle of products and they will then deliver it from a store to your home. Both of those models are growing very rapidly, and I think they offer the typical things that e-commerce offers, which is the convenience and sometimes the price benefit. But I think there's another thing as well, and that is the way that consumers are shopping is much more fluid and flexible in an e-commerce platform. So if one of you shops in let's say a wine shop and wants a French red wine, you can walk in and look at the French section. But if perhaps you might say, no, I don't care where it's from, I just want something that's light and fruity or dark and sturdy. These kinds of platforms are really helpful in navigating and exploring and having that almost value-added retail experience. So no question that both of them are growing very rapidly. And I guess the last piece is just the way that those platforms can link back to brand activation, where through the use of things like QR codes and other means, you can actually direct a consumer, a brand can direct a consumer directly to the retail checkout. So getting from awareness to purchase in one tap or one click. So obviously something that was probably coming anyway, greatly accelerated by the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think brand owners have had to really accelerate that direct-to-consumer strategy as well. We've seen in 2020, Molson Coors and Treasury Wines, for example, launch their e-commerce sites during that pandemic year, really to get that direct-to-consumer relationship. But of course, yes, they're competing with the typical online retailers and even Amazon, where I believe, Martin, we've seen a rise in alcohol purchase as well.
And I think to add to the different e-commerce types, I really have to add subscription services, because I do see the most innovative storytelling and pairing and navigational innovations coming from that space. Because especially with direct-to-consumer subscription services, because they don't get any awareness elsewhere. So they really have to work hard everywhere else. So, in the US, you talked about Grizzly. In Australia, my favorite is called Good Pair Days. When you set up your account, you set up your taste preferences. They gamify the system, so of course, it refines your choice and preference. With each wine, you also get educated in a fun way, so you can actually do little quizzes that ask you to identify all of these notes. So it's a lot of things wrapped in one. Of course, there's your pairing suggestions and history and provenance and all of that. And it's all done in really great, simple to use navigation and just really human language. So I think in terms of how to communicate occasions, navigation and choice, subscription services are going kind of like the full mile.
So, of course, in the off-trade, packaging plays such an important role in the experience. And so we can't ignore the topic of sustainability. Consumers are definitely seeking out sustainability-based solutions in the packaging. And, of course, they're interacting more with that in the home. So in what ways are brands responding, both in pack and in other methods?
I think it's interesting how we know that so many drinks come in environmentally responsible packaging. We've got glass, we've got aluminum, both highly recyclable. We've got plastics, we've got the incorporation of post-consumer recycled content plastics. So the elements are there. I really think, and I don't particularly like the term sustainability because it's been so overused for the past 20 years. Sometimes consumers don't really understand what it means. So I kind of like the term responsibility because it carries sort of a personal burden for the consumer. But we're seeing not as much clear or defined on-pack communication that this package is recyclable, that the secondary carton is recyclable, but you may have to take the inner bag out and dispose of that. So there's a lack of clear communication about sometimes even the most basic attributes, such as this bottle is recyclable or this pack can be reused or refilled. I think it was about a year ago now we saw the Absolute recycled bottle, which looked like shards of broken glass, and their intent with that was to really reinforce through like semiotics that packaging, and this glass package in particular, was recyclable. I don't believe consumers need to understand the science. They don't really necessarily need to understand the circular economy. What they need to understand is what I call the hyper actionability. What can I do as a consumer with this package based on what you as the brand, what are your inputs and what have you told me I can do to be a more responsible consumer? So I think the elements of the basic pack types and formats and materials are there. It's just we're lacking in very clear communication.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen that, David. I wrote about how spirits and wines need to get the basics right first. And sometimes there is a recyclable pack, but a brand just hasn't called it out and wasted the opportunity to have a greener story. I looked on our GMPD database, and I think I saw globally spirits, wines, and alcoholic RTDs only about 22% of launches made a sustainability, recyclability claim, and soft drinks were up around 38% globally. So just goes to show the catching up that alcoholic brands need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, I think it's interesting, I think brands today just simply believe that consumers understand that glass is recyclable, but we haven't told them the different variations. Is it clear glass? Is it amber glass? Is it green glass? To what degree and where can it be recyclable? So it's really about the nuances that we as an industry understand, and how do we better communicate that to consumers in a way that, like I said, is more hyper actionable. that hyperactionability is what we're now seeing being called the carbon handprint. What can a consumer do to be more responsible? How can they reduce their overall carbon footprint? But on a personal level, it's being called that handprint. So I really just think brands across all end-use categories, all geographies, just need to do a much better job. They need to kind of take a step back and say, are we really communicating accurately and clearly with consumers about what they can actually do? It's great if it's compostable, but does the consumer in that region have access to compostability? It's great if you as a brand are manufacturing using wind power or solar power, but what does that mean to the consumer? So we really have to think about what does it mean to the consumer and how can the consumer really take action to be more environmentally responsible.
And I do have to say also, when e-commerce, like a big part of our conversation today is e-commerce, is DTC. So a large part, there's a huge tension in between the convenience that we want from e-commerce and delivery, which is a lot about secondary packaging, and the fact that consumers also want more, quite honestly, amped up unboxing experiences. I mean, so once again, if you lose the physical touch point or the presence, you need that secondary box to arrive still with the kind of amped up flair. So there is, I think, where a lot of brands will find themselves in a bit of a quandary because they have to try and satisfy both. And we do see these in different consumer tests and reports, that's always the guilt factor about e-com and delivery. All of this packaging material, secondary packaging material, what am I going to do with it? It just takes that little bit off of the joy that you get from convenience. So if brands can overcome that, and we do see better brands do that with, of course, better materials, better printing, and David, to your point, if they can actually even turn those sustainability messages into cheeky copy that actually adds even one more layer of personality and not just a dry, this is recyclable. We do find brands like that. They come out a little bit ahead of the curve because they're trying to they manage to take away that last little bit of reservation that consumers might get about ordering more drinks online and getting it delivered at home.
If we think about Garçon wines, I don't know if that's just a European thing, but they have not only created the flattened bottle, let's call it, which helps in terms of delivery and carbon footprint in terms of you can basically fit more bottles into a case, therefore you need less transport. So not only have they come up with a really clever packaging solution to meet those responsibility requirements, but they also take the space that's usually on the label for tasting notes. They use that space to communicate with the consumer what they need to do with the packaging at the end of its use. So exactly as you were saying, Phil, I think that's a really interesting point because, we can use lots of other channels now to get tasting notes, for example, can't we?
You took the words out of my mouth, Zanny. That's the exact example I was going to offer, that when you open that flat carton, it talks about the carton is recyclable. That bottle is 100%, or it's PET, so it is recyclable. But they've turned it into what I call like show and tell graphics. They've told the consumer, they've showed the consumer, and it truly does become intuitive to the consumer about what I can do with it. It's direct, it's sort of cheeky, it's fun. And it even goes back to being called what I call post-worthy packaging, meaning it's so unique that even when it's empty, I'm probably going to save it, share it with my friends, put it on Instagram, put it on Facebook, and share it in some kind of post because it's just got that connection with consumers, whether it's just from e-commerce, whether it's from the use occasion, whether it's from packaging, the disposability, it's hyper actionable all over the place. So that's, to me, Garçon and Santiago Navarra, who's the CEO there, they've just done such a wonderful job. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I think, as we've talked about sustainability or responsibility from a packaging point of view, but brand owners are also trying hard to A, kind of change their production processes, and B, try to communicate with consumers about that in terms of sustainable production methodologies as well. So, for example, Budweiser are using solar power and wind turbine to power production, and the same for Heineken, who are also involved in sustainable barley cultivation as well.
About a third of consumers across categories and across geographic regions say they are prepared to boycott brands who don't behave ethically or responsibly. And that applies to the production of products, production of packaging, sourcing. It includes things like equality and diversity. And again, it's great when a brand accrues the benefits of maybe solar production, but we always have to take it back to the consumer. It's great if you as a brand are acting, environmentally responsibly or ethically, but what does that mean to me as a consumer? You're probably not giving me a price break because you're now getting your renewable production energy. So what are you doing for me as a consumer? And I think that's where the brands and the package manufacturers have to always think back to, what does this mean to the consumer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, on the carbon neutral side, I would add a couple of thoughts. Australian wines are doing a fantastic job of claiming that on pack, but it's a bit of a tricky area because consumers don't always completely believe or understand how a brand can claim carbon neutral. But for example, Hardy's wine in the UK has a 100% carbon neutral sticker on pack, and it's basically verified by a third party, UK Carbon Trust, who's done a certification on that. So, there's a job for those certification bodies to raise their profile and get better known, because at the moment I don't think consumers know them that well.
To Martin's point, we have to be very careful. I know within our Mintel Global New Products database, I have identified 8 different carbon claims: carbon neutral, positive, responsible, carbon free, carbon negative. But what we are also seeing is that consumers are beginning to look behind those claims, and Martin mentioned carbon offsets. We're already beginning to see a backlash among consumers about when they've actually learned what carbon offsetting means, which basically it means I can still emit the same amount of carbon I always have. I'm just buying my way out of it. We've seen the same thing with plastics neutral or plastics offsets. So we really have to, I don't want to say we're pulling the wool over consumers' eyes, but oftentimes carbon offsetting is a way of being a little bit less bad rather than actually being better for the environment. And the consumers are beginning to see that, and that plays into that percentage of consumers who are saying, it sounds like you're behaving ethically, but you're still doing the exact same thing and you're buying your way out of it. So we have to help consumers understand what these different carbon claims mean: neutral, positive, negative, responsible, free, carbon offset, carbon sequestered. So again, a little bit more clarity, so we're actually doing something that's better than something that's just less bad.
So just to wrap up then, what do we think alcohol brands can take away from these consumer shifts in the pandemic about how they should approach current and future disruptions?
Alcohol moderation is not going to go away. So that would be the first thing I would point out. We know from the UK, we've been tracking the trend since 2016, and it builds exponentially year on year. Younger people more and more are moderating, and I think we'll see that in the States and in LATAM, China. It will continue to be a thing, and so permissible drinks will need to. We will need permissible drinks in order to respond to that. So I think we've gone up a really steep learning curve, and we've now got the kind of ammunition that we need to take us forwards to the next normal.
I think from a brand perspective, so long as brands are speaking to their core audience with a consistent voice and a constant promise, the product can change and will continue to change, whether that's a packaging change, an ingredient change, a formulation change, whatever it may be. And companies have been, evolving their product mix all the time. Just the pace of it may be accelerated, or something large comes along, like the global pandemic, that really changes behavior or accelerates a behavior change that was, to your point, already, beginning to emerge. But the one thing is just to continue to speak with your consistent voice, the consistent brand promise, be true to the brand that you are, and consumers will continue to know what to expect from your own brand.
And I'll build on Bruce's comment there is, changing a package format or material is okay. Brands need to have those options, to be able to offer those options when supply chain disruptions dictate. But from my perspective in packaging, explain to the consumer why you changed and what the benefit of that change is to the consumer, whether it's use occasion, whether it's responsibility, whether it's a price point, whether it's a trial. Bring that consumer, into the fold of the conversation and explain to the consumer the benefit to them.
And I think it's a lot about agility as well. I think we've really learned how to be agile. We've always talked to our customers about speed to market. That's been a common theme forever. But agility in terms of changing direction for businesses has been really key. So, for example, the e-commerce point, we've seen whole marketing teams change structure to build more resource into the digital area, for example, and have to do that very quickly and quite seamlessly. So I think agility is a real theme here as well.
I think my take on agility is also brands just need to consider and be ready to pivot the whole spectrum marketing mix. Because if you think about how fast delivery models are evolving, subscription models are evolving, content platforms are evolving, it's not just, of course, pump out the product and just expect the retailer to do the job for you. You really can't do that. It's both a risk, but also an opportunity to really own a much larger share of ongoing day-to-day awareness through content, education, entertainment. So go beyond the product.
So that's been a really great discussion, and I'd like to really thank our partners Mintel, so Martin and David, for your input and insights. We've really enjoyed hearing from you today, and thanks to you for listening as well. We really appreciate you joining us.
If you're not yet thirsty for a drink of your own, you can head on to sjkinc.com, where you will find more insights, trend spotting articles, and also more sessions of our Around the World program. Thank you.